احنا هنا متواجدين بنجمع في الكوشوك عشان نشارك في المظاهرات السلمية لنحمي حالنا من اليهود، لنمنع عنهم الرؤية، وإن شاء الله ربنا بيحمينا، وإحنا متواصلين حتى تحرير فلسطين إن شاء الله.
ايوه عدلها 100% عدلها 100%.
جبنا الكوشوك عشان ايش؟ اللي عرقنا على السلم. والموري عشان ايش؟ لا لعمة تبع القناص عشان ما يقول نص ولا حدا.
Hi, it's Tim with Moriel TV and Moriel Radio here live in Columbus, Ohio. We're taking a break from the conference out here, and this is This Week in Prophecy.
Blessings in Jesus, dear friends, and as usual, we begin in the Middle East. Continuing conflict taking place every Friday in the regular weekly protests after Muslim prayers at the border fence between Israel and Gaza. On Friday, this Friday, that is yesterday, reports of 3 Palestinian radicals were killed, 200 wounded, and a total of 600 injured when Israelis opened fire with projectiles and fired live rounds when they came under attack from Palestinian gangs who were throwing projectiles over the fence towards the Israeli positions. The Israelis returned fire in self-defense, and a total of 3 were killed. The international media is, of course, covering this, and they're calling the Israeli action a blockade of Gaza. In fact, it's a border like any other border, and what the Israelis are simply monitoring the influx of weapons, radicals, and terrorists coming in and out of Gaza. They do not prevent humanitarian aid, food, or construction material not used or hijacked by Hamas for military construction. It is simply a defensive action, and it's no different than any other border, but of course the media is not reporting that. These weekly protests have gained something of a momentum, but the midweek protests have greatly faded and are only a fraction of what they were in terms of total participation. Nonetheless, the shootout began when the Israelis came under attack by Palestinian gangs who were incited to try to cross the fence line into Israel. Again, a total of 3 have been killed when the Israelis returned fire. This week in prophecy, much of the action has taken place in Israel and also in Washington. The American Secretary of Defense, Mr. Mattis, has said that a conflict between Israel and Iran in Syria is quite likely. It will quite likely, according to the American Secretary of Defense, be an armed conflict within Syria between the United States and Israel. This may be a reason why President Trump wants American troops out of most of Syria, away from the Iranian positions, and coming to only eastern Syria, on the eastern bank of the Euphrates River, concentrated there and remaining there, but not near active Iranian positions, so the United States will not be directly implicated in Israeli attacks or Iranian counterattacks on the Israelis should armed conflict take place within Syria between Israel and Iran, which according to Mr. Mattis is quite likely. Mr. Mattis was in Israel, meeting with Israeli officials in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, while at the same time Avigdor Lieberman, the Israeli defense minister, has urged the United States not to leave Syria completely, again as we've spoken about in the past, not to repeat the mistakes of Barack Obama, creating a vacuum or a void that will be filled by radicals or possibly by Iran. At the same time, when Avigdor Lieberman came to Washington, the commanding general of the American Central Command, CENTRICOM, General Joseph Voder, went to Israel to coordinate what is obviously going to be some kind of coming military action in Syria. At least the tentative arrangements for it to take place are taking shape. Do not be surprised if this contingency is realized. Obviously, General Voder and Avigdor Lieberman and the Secretary of Defense Mattis have been preparing for what's going to happen. Mr. Trump is pushing for an American withdrawal from parts of Syria to make way for an Israeli incursion into Syria to attack the Iranian positions. Again, this is quite likely to happen according to Mr. Mattis. At the same time, there have been more activities in this area concerning Russia. Mr. Putin, indignant about the American attacks, together with the British and the French, in response to the use of chemical agents against the civilian population by the Assad regime, and also angered over the killing of 200 to 300 Russian mercenaries by American and American-backed Kurdish forces on the eastern bank of the Euphrates. Mr. Putin is responding in a number of ways. One of which is, again, as we reported last week, the deployment of the S-300 anti-aircraft missile system inside of Syria in support of Assad and in conjunction with the Iranians. But also, he's waging electronic countermeasure warfare against American drones and against American AC-130s. Now, these are simply cyber attacks, or they are electronic signal attacks, signal warfare. But actually, Russia is either doing this directly or it's being done by Syrian or Iranians with Russian advisors. But they are interfering with the signaling and guidance systems of American AC-130 aircraft that are used in tactical support of the American-backed and advised Kurdish forces. So now you have Russia engaged in open electronic warfare against the United States in Syria. When you put this together with the fact that the Americans, together with the Kurds, have killed perhaps 200 to 300 Russians, and you put this together with Mr. Putin's threats to retaliate for the American, British, and French missile attacks on the 3 positions of the Assad regime that were attacked in response to the chemical weapons attacks on his own population, we see a conflict that Washington and Moscow are trying to avoid. Neither Washington or Moscow want a direct shootout between the United States and Russia. At the same time, the United States knows that Israel is going to have to go after Iran inside of Syria. That's what appears to be happening, which is why the Americans are anxious to get their own troops out of harm's way. However, they are being pressed both by certain voices within the Trump administration and by the Israelis not to fully withdraw. Continuous with this, following the visit of President Emmanuel Macron of France to Washington, the French have increased their forces in alliance with the United States in eastern Syria. And the Pentagon has announced it is staying in Syria, but it is going to be mainly deployed, again, in the eastern region of Syria bordering Iraq to try to keep Americans out of direct conflict with Russia or Iran. At the same time, an attack by Israel on the Iranians in response to Iranian aggression is not at all unlikely. This could very quickly spread into Israeli attacks on Hezbollah on Lebanon, or Hezbollah attacks on Galilee from Lebanon. But you put it all together. The Americans are not leaving, even though they'd like to, but they are being careful to try to get their troops out of harm's way before the Israelis have a conflict with Iran, which the Pentagon now says is likely. At the same time, you see coordinating efforts of General Voder and Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman. At the same time, the French are increasing their forces in Syria in alliance with the United States, and at the same time, the Russians are actively involved in jamming the signal systems of American AC-130s. This is a powder keg that is sizzling, and it's happening this week in prophecy. This week in prophecy, we saw efforts to block the appointment of CIA Director Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State. Mr. Pompeo graduated first from his class in West Point. He has a distinguished career both in the military and in diplomacy. Highly qualified, and it was he who negotiated the meeting between the President of South Korea and the dictator of North Korea this week, taking place in preparation for Mr. Trump's own scheduled parlance with the North Koreans. This has been a tremendous and almost unthinkable diplomatic breakthrough that's taken place over a matter of no more than 6 weeks. Mr. Pompeo was directly engaged in it, and it helped persuade certain Democratic members of the Senate to vote for his approval to be Secretary of State. What we have witnessed repeatedly in Washington is the Democratic contingents of Congress and the Senate under Mr. Schumer doing anything they can to oppose anybody appointed by Mr. Trump, simply in order to attack Mr. Trump politically, putting their political vengeance at having lost the presidential election before the operations of government and the good of the country. This is quite astounding. The nature of the attacks on Mr. Pompeo were led by Democratic Senator from Connecticut, Chris Murphy, a left-wing Democrat. He has attacked Mr. Pompeo as being anti-Islamic and being an Islamophobe. Mr. Murphy is closely associated with the CAIR, an organization we've warned about repeatedly, for which we have asked for congressional investigation and basically closing them down due to their terror associations. 3 times the FBI has named officials of CAIR, the Council of American Islamic Relations, as unindicted parties involved in the funding of terror, yet it still is allowed to exist. The Bush administration, because of their own association with the Saudi Arabians who fund CAIR, pandered to it and allowed it to continue to operate after September 11th, despite the terror associations. Again, we've warned people many times that the Saudi Arabians carried the House of Bush around in their back pocket. The Bush family, of course, was struck with the death of Barbara Bush this past week in prophecy. Barbara Bush, of course, was a pro-abortion advocate. Now her husband, George H. Bush, is hospitalized at an advanced age. We celebrate the fall of the House of Bush, that the Bush dynasty lost the presidential primary to Mr. Trump. We hope we have seen the end of this terrible regime that has been in bed with radical Islam for so long, pandering to them. But now the CAIR has shifted from the House of Bush to their contacts within the Democratic Party, especially this week in prophecy with Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. His attacks on Mr. Pompeo stem from Mr. Pompeo's associations with the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, an organization of moderate, westernized, educated Muslims who oppose jihad and radical Islam. These are the best Muslims living in the West. They are not fundamentalists, they are not jihadists, and they oppose those who are. They call for a democratization of the Islamic world, and they call for an acceptance of Western democracy by Arabs living in Western countries. These are the kinds of Muslims the West has been called on to parley with as an alternative to the radicals. Yet because Mr. Pompeo did that, associating with moderate Muslims who oppose radical Islam, he's being called an Islamophobe by Senator Chris Murphy, who is, again, a pawn of the CAIR. I would call him a pawn of the Council of American Islamic Relations that, according to the Justice Department, three times, has been implicated in raising funds for terrorist groups. Mr. Pompeo has also been involved with participation in meetings and conferences with the Middle East Forum, another organization calling for moderation in Islam, and the investigative project on terror. Yet, despite his working with moderate Islams and with organizations who are calling for the democratization of Islamic countries, he's being called intolerant by a Democratic senator who's now playing the kind of role the House of Bush used to play, pandering to radical Sunni jihadist Islam. Although the CAR denies it is that, again, we come back to the fact that three times the Justice Department has fingered unindicted participants in the funding of terror from the CAIR. I pray to God the Lord removes Chris Murphy, and I thank God that Mr. Pompeo, who's a supporter of Israel and who is a supporter of human rights within the Islamic community, was appointed Secretary of State. What we've basically seen happen is this: the Bush dynasty, the House of Bush, which was in league with the Saudi Arabians, are now out of vogue with the Saudi Arabians. This directly relates to the change of power from Prince Talal bin Saud and the new arising of Mohammed bin Salman as the crown prince. The Kingdom Fund and the funding of radical mosques has now decreased somewhat because of the changes of power within Saudi Arabia and within the House of Saud itself. Bin Talal was one of those who was kept in detention within the Carlyle Hotel in Riyadh. Meanwhile, the CAIR, who is controlled by Islamist interests from the Persian Gulf, including Saudi Arabia, has shifted from the Republican puppets, has shifted from people who they always relied on to do their dirty work, such as James Baker and Chuck Hagel and the Bush dynasty, to the Democrats. We see this with Linda Saucer, among others. Linda Saucer likewise attacked moderate Muslim women, activists against forced genital mutilation of Muslim girls. Yet Saucer attacked them in favor of those who were sexually mutilating these Muslim young girls. But this did not stop the Pink Hat movement, the alt-left, the left wing of the Democratic Party, from featuring the same Linda Saucer as a speaker, a keynote speaker at their events. She's being hosted in left-leaning universities throughout the United States, despite her war against human rights and women's rights in the Muslim world. So we see the hypocrisy of the American left yelling about women's rights, while at the same time they're promoting the villain who opposes women's rights, who's in favor of forced genital mutilation, who attacks moderate Muslims who oppose it, Linda Saucer. Linda Salser has also made statements that one cannot be a feminist and a Zionist. You cannot be supportive of Israel if you are a feminist, putting naive Jewish American women in a position where they are being told, if you're a Jew who supports Israel, the land of your forefathers, then you are, in fact, not a true feminist. This has not stopped the left from promoting her. This reflects on the insanity of left-wing American Jews more than anything else. I've compared them to Jews who would pay their own train fare to Auschwitz. That's their mentality. They volunteer to wear a yellow star on their garments to publicly display themselves as targets for anti-Semitism. How stupid can people be? How unbelievably stupid can people be? Yet this is exactly what we are seeing. This collaboration with your enemies and the enemies of your people. This reminds us of the Menelaus syndrome in the story of the Maccabees, where the Seleucids were occupying Israel, were restricting Israel's freedom of religion, were imposing the paganistic and godless elements of Hellenistic culture, and there were Jews who collaborated with them, such as Menelaus, who was assassinated by the Maccabees in the story of Hanukkah. That same thing is happening today with left-wing American Jews, pandering to people like Sarsa and pandering to the alt-left, which is vehemently anti-Zionist, but a form of anti-Zionism that, once unmasked, shows its anti-Semitic nature and credentials. We refer back to the late Martin Luther King, who said and who wrote that anti-Zionism is simply the current manifestation of anti-Semitism. We are in agreement with Martin Luther King. Yet this is what's taking place this week in prophecy. The CAIR, the pro-Islamist faction, active in the United States politically and financially, in funding the pro-Sharia agenda, having lost its influence with the decline of the House of Bush, has now shifted increasingly to the Democratic Party with people like Chris Murphy and the feminist movement. But we see this happening conspicuously this week in prophecy. We have seen two visits this week in prophecy to the White House, one again with President Emmanuel Macron of France, and the other with Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel is facing tremendous unpopularity in her home country and a political threat to her government because of her determination to import 1 million Syrian refugees without vetting them, knowing that they contain a number of radicals, even in the face of video recorded molestation of German women by Islamic refugees from Syria and other countries that have come into her country. She does not like Mr. Trump, and Mr. Trump has not gotten along well with her. It is their second meeting. This one put on a public face to appear to be more amicable. But Ms. Merkel, much like Mr. Macron of France, President Macron, both tried to persuade President Trump to continue the to continue the Obama pact with Iran, negotiated by Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and John Kerry, which Mr. Trump has continually opposed, as has the Israelis, as a sellout. It was seen as a sellout of the United States, a sellout of the more moderate Persian Gulf countries, of the Saudis, and of Israel, helping to create a almost alliance of convenience between Israeli interests and Saudi interests. Nonetheless, this has become very much the reality, coming to a head in the White House this week in prophecy. Both European leaders have left Washington stating they don't think that Mr. Trump is going to be willing to continue Mr. Obama's agreement with Iran on the same terms. Essentially allows Iran to pursue the development of nuclear weapons overtly within 10 years, but does not in any adequate way prevent covert research and development from happening even now. Inspections are simply not taking place unless the Iranians are given 30 days warning of an inspection coming. Neither does it take into account the Iranian development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which can hit Europe, can certainly hit Israel, and may eventually have the capacity to reach the United States. Again, the Obama administration released $150 billion, 150 billion US dollars in frozen funds to Iran, despite Iran continuing to fund international terror, including the killing of Americans in Afghanistan. Again, many people looking at this, many people have used the term treason in describing the actions of the Obama administration. Why is Mrs. Merkel, Angela Merkel, and Mr. Macron trying to press President Trump to continue this terrible agreement that the Saudis, the Israelis, and the moderate Gulf states are all dead set against? Major German industries and major French industries are capitalizing on contracts and sales of technology to Iran that are helping the economies of these European countries and helping these corporate interests. If the United States abrogates this agreement, which is not a legal treaty, it was never ratified by the US Senate, as unacceptable under its present terms, it will either have to be renegotiated or there will be an automatic reintroduction of US embargoes. Now understand, the embargoes will not simply be against Iran. The embargoes directly against Iran are one thing, but there will be further American embargoes against European conglomerates doing business with Iran. Hence the American market will be closed to these European industries who are supplying technology to the Iranians. This is what Ms. Merkel was concerned about, as was Mr. Macron. Additionally, the Americans continue to complain about the trade deficit that the USA has with Europe to the tune of about $130 billion annually in the trade deficit that the Trump administration wants corrected and adjusted. This includes possible excise taxes on the importation and further duties on aluminum, and steel. All of this was on the table. It's not clear what Ms. Merkel has gone away with, but it is clear what she's not gone away with. It is not clear exactly what Mr. Macron has come away with, but it's clear what they've not come away with. There has been no commitment by the Trump administration to continue this Obama agreement with Iran. Something is going to happen. It will either be renegotiated or the embargoes will be reintroduced. In the meantime, however, German and French industry are going to have to count the cost. Who do they want to do business with? The United States or with Iran? That is what was taking place in Washington this very week in prophecy. So recapping once again, it has been a good thing that Mr. Pompeo, whose credentials are impeccable, whose qualifications are beyond dispute, was ratified by the Senate as the next Secretary of State. He'll be far better than his predecessor. He's a conservative, and he very much subscribes to a pro-Israel agenda and the Trump agenda. Within the next 3 to 4 weeks, the United States is scheduled to open its embassy in Jerusalem. It is unclear if Mr. Trump himself will attend or not, but it is clear the embassy is going to be open. It will indeed be a hallmark. There are also rumors, however, coming out of Jerusalem that the Trump administration has begun to pressure Israel about the development of new settlements on the West Bank. These things are rumored. Neither the Trump administration nor the Israeli government has issued any public statements to this effect. What we do know, however, is something happening in parallel once again. The legal efforts to try to unseat Mr. Trump as the American president because he won the election and the legal efforts to try to unseat Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu as Rosh HaMemshalah, as Prime Minister of Israel, because his Likud party won the election, have both receded and seen major setbacks this week in prophecy, including the United States Congress saying that there is no evidence that Mr. Trump colluded with Russia. Also, the scandals concerning Mr. Comey and new pressure on the Mueller special prosecutor's efforts to investigate Mr. Trump for a crime that Congress says never happened have very much begun to shift the situation in favor of the Trump administration this week. Mr. Trump has reached new heights of popularity, much higher than President Obama had at this point in his first administration, his first term as president. The situation in Korea has even caused some people to suggest Mr. Trump should be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. It's doubtful or questionable if that will happen, though it's not impossible. Nonetheless, it has definitely worked to his favor and his popularity. At the same time, Mr. Netanyahu's popularity with the Israeli voters has increased to his favor. Thus, we saw what happened in both Israel and the United States. The left, having lost the election democratically, tried to resort to legal means to bring down the government of Mr. Netanyahu and the administration of Mr. Trump. It is not working. They went to legal means. But now there's a consolidation of the power base of both Mr. Netanyahu in Israel and Mr. Trump in Washington. Quite a situation taking place this week in prophecy. And the icing on the cake has been the approval of Mr. Pompeo, whose opposition for approval and for ratification as the appointed Secretary of State has only come about for political reasons of anti-Trumpism, nothing to do with him himself, other than the CAIR and radical left-aligned Chris Murphy and others like him attacking him as an Islamophobe and intolerant because of his association with moderate Muslims. What an ugly, hypocritical situation exists within the U.S. Senate. Nonetheless, it is all happening this week in prophecy. The commander of the American Central Command in Israel, the Israeli defense minister in Washington, troop movements taking place in Syria, the Trump administration wanting the American forces, boots on the ground, out of harm's way as a conflict between Israel and Iran begins to take shape in Syria, according to the American Secretary of Defense. At the same time, the Russians are engaging in electronic warfare against American aircraft and drones. Something is obviously brewing in Syria. What it shall be, we shall see. Again, we're reluctant and hesitant to yell Gog and Magog, but it may be a prelude to a Gog and Magog scenario. All of it happening this week in prophecy. Two key European leaders coming to the White House consecutively within a few days of each other, the President of France and the Chancellor of Germany, both asking that Mr. Trump continue Mr. Obama's sellout to Iran. Mr. Trump has not agreed. Again, we shall see within the next few weeks what is going to happen when the Obama agreement is up for presidential review. My name is Jacob Prasch. God bless, and thank you so much for listening. Please keep the American president and Mr. Netanyahu in your prayers.
Thank you, Jacob.